Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. We live in very interesting times. I think any generation will make that claim, but we do live in interesting times because after a very long period of autocracy, the heart of the Muslim world is experiencing or is going through the experience of removing those autocratic regimes, and it's struggling. As we see every day, we hear in the news, and when we read about it, it almost seems as if the autocracy continues and perhaps democracy remains elusive. But that's sort of the nature of the game. If you think about it, if you look at the West, how the West achieved political enlightenment, how they were able to achieve good governance, it took them a while. I mean, the West, based on its Judeo-Christian heritage, and if you look at the trajectory of a Renaissance, Reformation, Enlightenment, and then you reached a stage where the West democratized and achieved political stability and essentially moved into the modern era where hereditary rule and oppressive systems were basically discarded. It's going to be there's going to be a different trajectory. We can't say what kind of trajectory the Muslim world will go through. And then when we say the Muslim world, it is very large. There are different parts of the Muslim world that are not similar to the other. And so each area, however you want to define it, you can go by the concept of the nation state, or you can go by region, or you can go by, you can take the larger collective of the Middle East or South Asia. Every one of them is going to have their own trajectory. For example, if you look at a country like Pakistan, Pakistan was created through a democratic constitutional process, but ultimately democracy remains elusive there because of military rule and the inability of those who were promoting democracy in the Muslim world in Pakistan did not live up to democratic standards. You have Egypt, which had a parliamentary experience during the monarchy, pre-Nasser, going back to the days of the dynasty that was established by Muhammad Ali Pasha. So you have that. You also see what happened in Iraq, where you had a monarchy that was bringing in it was sort of a constitutional monarchy, but then the Ba'ath came in and took over in the 1960s. And so you had a very long autocratic and dark period. You have the case of Saudi Arabia, which for the last 250 years, or more or less, has been under a monarchy, and that sort of rejects democracy as we understand it. You have the Turkish experience, from the Ottoman Empire to Mustafa Kemal Ataturk, and now, the last 10 years, where you see the move away from sort of this hardcore Kemalism, which is a particular form of secularism. It's laicism. It's the French model, where it's defined with religion being almost absent from the public realm, from public affairs. And now we have sort of a move towards the American style, where secularism is defined as religious neutrality, where different people of different sects, different confessional backgrounds, religious backgrounds, can all coexist. So let's fast forward and zero in on the Arab Spring. And actually, before we get into the Arab Spring, let's look at another dynamic. I'm going to be talking about two things. One is the Arab Spring, and the other is the empowerment of Iran and Shia Muslims in the region because of regime change in Iraq. These two dynamics are converging. and they're converging in a very complex way. They're crisscrossing, and I think that Syria is where the fault line is. You think of an earthquake. You say, where is the fault line? And the geological department will tell you, well, it was measured here in this area, which is usually far from the affected areas. So what I'm trying to say here is that Syria will be sort of the focal point, but it will have repercussions, spreading across each area, and it's already happening in many ways. So if you look at regime change in Iraq, regardless of why it happened, what were the reasons for it, that's a debate that we'll not get into. Unless someone wants to ask a question, I'll be more than happy to entertain it. But for our purposes, it did happen. And the result was that the regime that was dominated by a small clique and dominated by the minority Sunni community in Iraq and suppressing the Kurdish community and the Shia community, that was removed. And it led to the empowerment of, it brought in a democratic dispensation. It's not perfect. It's far from perfect. It has many problems. But nonetheless, there was space created. There was an electoral system that allowed various Shiite groups to come and, attain power, along with the Kurds and some Sunnis. That essentially, if you look at it, I look at things spatially in my line of work, and if you look at, and specifically in geographic terms, so if you can imagine, I wish we had a map here somewhere, but we don't, but we'll use our imagination this evening. So if you look at the northern rim of the Middle East, the northern rim of the Middle East starts from Western Afghanistan, goes through Iran, through Iraq, through Syria, and to Lebanon. This was referred to as sort of the Shia crescent, if you will, by King Abdullah of Jordan in 2004, and when he expressed displeasure over the fall of Saddam and how the United States had altered the balance of power in the region. And so that, with the rise of the Shia-led government in Iraq, that sort of arc, if you will, was completed, and it was led by Iran. Iran being the preeminent Shia state in that region, and extending all the way to Lebanon. And there are two very interesting developments that didn't get a whole lot of attention while it was happening because of sort of the euphoria of the Arab Spring. One was December 21st, 2011, which is after 9 months of grueling negotiations and impasse after the 2010, March 7th, 2010 elections. You had a government formed. This is December 21st, 2010. And so you had al-Maliki getting his second term. He was prime minister for the first term. He got his second term after 9 months of negotiations following the elections. So that was one incident. The second incident happened a few weeks later when in Lebanon, when Hezbollah was able to engineer the ouster of the Hariri government and brought to power the current Prime Minister Miqati, and he led a government that is supported by Hezbollah. So in geopolitical terms, from the Iranian point of view, it had achieved its desired sort of sphere of influence that was stretching from Western Afghanistan all the way to Lebanon. From the Iranian point of view, as we say in North America, life was good from a political point of view. And so, but what happened is that then the Arab Spring came in. And the Arab Spring, in the beginning, if you notice, it was just North Africa. It was in specific areas. It started in Tunisia, went to Egypt, Libya. But it ultimately had to reach Syria. Nobody expected that it would happen in Syria because Syria is a peculiar state. It is a state where it's very much not just your simple autocracy, simple dictatorship. It is a totalitarian state. There is no room for dissenting views and whatnot, and it is led by a minority Alawite community. But it would be wrong to say that it's only Alawites. It is also the majority community Sunnis are part of that structure as well, and continue to be. The fact that President Bashar al-Assad is still in power after 2 years while everybody else is gone, his contemporaries have faded away, speaks volumes about how this is not just Alawites. Because if you think about it logically, if you're 10-15% of the population, there is no way in the face of this of such a massive uprising that you could sustain your hold if you were not supported by people who were of the majority community, the Sunni persuasion. And then, of course, it's not just Sunnis and Alawites. There are Ithna Ashariya, there are Ismaili, Druze, Christians, and of course Kurds. So it's a complex dynamic. Now, what is happening is that from the U.S. point of view and from the Turkish point of view, and you can include the Saudis and the Qataris in this, regime change in Syria is necessary from their point of view to undo the effects of regime change in Iraq. So if you're following my line of reasoning, is that because Iraq empowered the Shia, and with and more importantly Iran, the Shia are not the issue, it's Iran which is the issue from the point of view of all of these countries. So and specifically from the Saudi point of view, the Saudis are looking at when they looked at Iraq prior to the Arab Spring, it was a lost cause because ultimately the opponent sect had taken over. And in a way that was legitimate. I mean, it was democratically elected, and therefore, from the Saudi point of view, this was a huge threat. Now, Iran had gained disproportionate amount of power, and by extension, the Shia had gained disproportionate amount of power, and therefore, how do you counter that? How do you block that advance? Well, Arab Spring came, and specifically in Syria, it allowed for the Saudis and their allies to punch a hole in that arc of influence, in that northern rim of the Middle East, and so there is hence the effort to support the rebels, and because if you think about it, you contrast it with the behavior of the Americans and the Saudis, and in Bahrain. Bahrain, they're not going to support that uprising because, again, it's geosectarianism. It is geopolitical sectarianism. You do not want, if you're Saudi and if you're in the United States, you do, and if you're any one of those other Gulf states, you do not want, allies of Iran to be empowered. Demographics work the other way around. And so what we have going here is that Syria is, all eyes are on Syria, that you cannot undermine Iran in Iraq because Iran has an edge over there because of demographics, because of the geopolitical situation. So the way to undermine Iranian influence in the region is to get rid of this regime. Now the problem is, here's where it gets complicated. And here's where those who are allied against Iran have internal differences. So from the Saudi point of view, they're willing to use Al-Qaeda or they're willing to use jihadists to go fight, the Shia and the Alawites and the Iranians in Iraq, in Syria. The Americans are not supportive of that. The Americans do not think that this is the right way to go about it, and they're very apprehensive. Hence, the news today in the Wall Street Journal that Obama blocked the delivery of weapons. I mean, they don't know. This is another Afghanistan in the making. There's one of my colleagues, Professor Muhammad Ayub from Michigan State University, wrote a really nice article. I think it was about a year ago, where he said, I think it was in Foreign Policy, and he said that Turkey would be wise to learn from Pakistan, in the sense that if you support radical, jihadis to achieve a particular geopolitical goal, there will be fallout. And you can see how Pakistan is suffering because of that. And it's been suffering for 30 years. And the Afghans are suffering, the Pakistanis are suffering. And so Turkey should not make the same mistake. Turkey understands that, and Turkey is not really as enthusiastic about this whole enterprise. And therefore you see them going one step forward, two steps backwards. and they're trying to understand how to achieve this. And so the goal is each of these actors, the Americans, if you noticed in December, the United States didn't endorse the Syrian opposition until there were certain changes made to it. They blacklisted certain groups like Jabhat al-Nusra, which is a jihadist group, which is close to Al-Qaeda, or at least in thinking, if not organizationally. And they said that we need people who are more mainstream. We cannot, yes, we want to weaken Iran, but I do not want to weaken Iran and create a bigger problem at the same time. Ultimately, this is a difficult choice. This is a difficult choice even for the Israelis. The Israelis are looking at this and saying, oh my God, what is happening here and all around us? And from their national security point of view, this is a very messy situation. Egypt is in turmoil. Jordan is having these internal this internal crisis that is really putting stress on the Hashemite regime, and now Syria, and so if the end result of this, because if you think about it, what is going to happen? We have to be very specific about terminology. Regime change means that one regime goes, another one comes in. Yeah. It takes time for that to happen. So what you do have for the longest time is regime collapse. And when you have regime collapse, it means there's anarchy. When there's anarchy, there are all sorts of groups that are out there that, most of them are unsavory, and they're all united to get rid of the dictator, but then they start fighting with each other. We saw this in Afghanistan when Najibullah's government was toppled. Those same groups that were so united under one banner fighting the Soviets and the communists, once the goal was done, they started fighting with each other. And we still are in that phase where civil war has continued in Afghanistan since 1979 until today. It has taken different shapes and forms, but it's continuing. You see this, we saw this in Iraq, but in Iraq, what happened was that, we can all criticize the United States and say, they invaded Iraq and whatnot, but at the end of the day, 150,000 troops did make a difference in that you do have a government there. There is terrorism, there are bombs go off, there is insecurity, there is poverty, there is corruption, there is everything, but there is still a system. There is still a parliament, there is still some method to the madness. You don't have those troops in Syria. No, the United States has moved beyond this doctrine of boots on the ground. It's looking at, it has moved away from that old doctrine and is now saying that we will do smart intervention. Smart intervention is the use of unmanned aerial vehicles, drones in popular parlance, and special operations forces. And that's it. The United States is not interested. Therefore, you see, nobody's going into Libya. Libya is another, basket case. It's after the fall of Gaddafi, it's in a situation where it's not headed in the right direction, or at least the desired direction where it can stabilize. But the United States is not interested. Look at Mali. Is the United States running in there? No, it's the French doing the bidding. In Syria, they're telling the Turks, it's your problem. You deal with it. We'll help with whatever we can, but we're really, really allergic to this idea that, in order to get rid of the Iranians, we will, in the process, empower, Al-Qaeda style jihadists. So the Arab Spring is a dilemma for everybody, but the underlying thing is that the Arab Spring has magnified geopolitical sectarianism, where there is a struggle. So what you have emerging in a very early stage. I mean, part of my job is to sort of look at the future and see what is emerging. And what I see emerging is that there is this Shia sphere of influence in the northern rim of the Middle East. It's not going to go away anywhere. And of course, you have now a Muslim Brotherhood led, if you will, Arab Spring in North Africa, in Egypt. It remains to be seen how far they go in Jordan and Syria, or even in Yemen. And so you have these two spheres of influence that are centering in Syria. And Syria is unfortunately going to be a long civil war. I don't see any good outcome out of that because it's such a zero-sum game. So how can Syria move away from civil war to democratization? Well, I mean, it's very simple. No one is interested in completely demolishing this current state structure, unless you are the Saudis or you are, the more extreme groups, the radical groups in Syria. Even Qatar is not interested in that. The United States is certainly not. Ultimately, there has to be some sort of a negotiated settlement. So what kind of negotiated settlement can we have which will allow for the opposition and the government to share power? One of the things is that the fact of the matter is that the current government in Syria has been, extremely brutal. They have killed, and not just in the last 2 years. I'm going back 40 years. They've killed tens of thousands of people, and there is bad blood, and people are waiting for retribution. This is the nature of human beings. When people will want revenge, and you cannot control this kind of thing, especially if you don't have a government, and especially if you don't have a large force. And one of the reasons why sectarian war did not really spiral out of control in Iraq was because there were 150,000 American troops there, and that made a difference. But now we don't have that. There's no such thing as a neutral, sort of semi-neutral player in between. And so what you're going to have is a bloodbath. Ultimately, if you look at from the point of view of the Alawites, what kind of situation are they looking at? If they lose power, they're not just looking at becoming a political minority. What they're looking at is becoming an endangered community, because they're 10-15%, and they know that the other side, they've suppressed them for so long that the other side is going to come after them. So losing political power is tantamount to actual, physical threat. And so they're not going to go quietly into the night. From the Iranian point of view, from the Iraqi point of view, from the point of view of Hezbollah in Lebanon, they are not going to allow Syria to fall. So you'll have a continuation of war. At some point, if the rebels gain the edge, this government will collapse. It's a matter of time. Does that mean there's going to be a Sunni government in Syria? No, because then you go into insurgency. See, it's easy to demolish something. It takes years to demolish something, but it's still easy. But then it's even more harder to rebuild something and have a negotiated settlement. So what are we looking at? We're looking at, unfortunately, something like, several years of civil war, which is unfortunately the way things are going to go. It's going to heighten sectarian tensions in the region. There will be a spillover. One of the things for the Saudis, it is sort of a double-edged sword. The Saudis want to get rid of Iranian influence along the northern rim. They want to see the collapse of this government. But then what? Then, if you cannot establish a Sunni government, you're going to have a spillover effect. Continued sectarian violence, spills over. It spills over into Iraq. It'll spill over into Bahrain, in the eastern province of Saudi Arabia. And so, unfortunately, I have to be the bearer of bad news this evening. What we're looking at, and this is sort of the reality, we're looking at a very, very difficult situation. And there is, there is no good solution. There are no good options. I'm going to stop right here because I think I've spoken enough. And let's have, a conversation, a normal one, instead of just me lecturing. Thank you. Assalamu alaikum.
Time for question and answers. Clearly an easy topic to have some debate on.
Kamran, thank you for that interesting observations. 2 points. One is that, this discussion about the Shia Crescent, I think in terms of time, it was really quite potent before the Arab Spring. just after the toppling of Saddam Hussein and so on. That was the time. Obviously, you're right that there was concern, especially in the Gulf monarchies, that this is changing the whole equation. But since the Arab Spring, there's a different dynamic, which I feel is probably not reflected in what you said, and that is there is also a Saudi or Saudi-led thinking of how to stop this Arab Spring, right? And that's why you have seen the empowerment of the Salafi forces in Egypt and Tunisia and Libya and so on, which in some ways could be much more dangerous because, the stability of those countries is endangered because, you can look at Egypt, the Salafi parties have got, I think, about 40% of what the Muslim Brotherhood has got. And then that's an equation which is quite difficult to see. And you see now, for example, that in the UAE and so on, there is a lot of pressure on the Muslim Brotherhood, arrests and so on, as you know. So I think there are multiple dynamics playing here. On the Saudi side also, while they don't like the Iranians, which is fine, we understand that, but they also don't like the Arab Spring because that's a potential problem for them, especially not in the eastern side, but in the mainstream. Especially now that you have this whole succession problem in Saudi Arabia itself coming to a head, yeah, because all these geriatrics, one by one, they have to go, and who will come. The second point I wanted to say was that the situation of the Kurds overall. In Iraq, they have managed to carve out a share bigger than their numbers in terms of power and whatever. In Iran, I think they have found a modus operandi with the regime, if you like. You don't hear that much resentment or overt opposition or so on, right? So it's really Turkey and Syria where this dynamic, and you're quite right, and Ayub probably was referring to this idea that if Turkey plays with that, its own Kurds and the Syrian Kurds could threaten its own stability, right? Now, what is interesting is that the Turkish government is trying to forge a good relationship with the Barzani faction of the Iraqi Kurds, right? And I don't know where that is. I think that's probably potentially more destabilizing for Iraq and other places. Huh? And finally, you look at recently, there is some kind of rapprochement between Iran and Pakistan. Now, Pakistan is saying we are not really going to stop this oil pipeline because that's in our national interest and so on. And unless Pakistan is using it as a bargaining power to get some American aid, I don't know, but that's Pakistan's problem. If that happens, then there are other worries for Saudi Arabia to think about, right?
Of course.
So I think that what I'm trying to say is that apart from this Saudi fear of this encirclement by sectarian, ideas which they don't like, they also have a bigger worry on the Arab Spring itself, and I don't know how that will play out.
No, you're absolutely right. Thank you for pointing those. Those are three very important points. There's only just so much that one can cover in about 15, 20 minutes before you start to bore people. So before I wanted to, sound boring, I wanted to end. But let me take a few minutes to address each of those points, which are very valid. Saudi Arabia is in a dilemma. Saudi Arabia's dilemma is that on one hand is Iran, on the other hand is the Muslim Brotherhood. Iran, it's clear, you can rile up the whole population, the Iranians are coming, the Shia are coming, and therefore you can create unity. So Iran is in many ways, an easier issue for them to deal with. The Muslim Brotherhood is a very complex issue because you cannot say, oh, these people are, Shia or, a non-Muslim or some bad sect or something. They tried. But ultimately, the Brotherhood is a reality. The biggest problem between the Brotherhood and Saudi Arabia is that they are competing models of Islamic governance. And the Muslim Brotherhood offers a better model, especially because the leadership is geriatric. The Saudi system is in decay. Why is the Saudi system in decay? And I don't speak this in pejorative terms. My job is as an analyst to look at it objectively and see. So, I bear no ill feelings towards anyone. It's because this is the name of the game. You have to, if you're going to be a serious analyst, you have to be objective. But having said that, in the sons of Abdulaziz, about 27 or 28 of them who really mattered. I forget how many total he had. But this is a small number. Within this small number, if you look at since the Abdulaziz died in I think 64, no, not 64, he died in 58. If you look at the number of people who have come, this is a very small group. Many of the sons were very happy to do business. If I get my share of money, I don't really want to be in politics, I'm happy. So in the end, you had a very small subset who were involved in politics. It was very easy for all of them to say, well, look, yes, we all have different moms, but we're brothers at the end of the day. So if we need to stick together, we need to sort these things out. So you could have a sort of a campfire, and you could sit and you can decide the important things of the country and the future, especially succession. And they endured. They endured very well. They went through the abdication of Saud. They went through the assassination of Faisal, and then Khalid, Fahad, all the way until now. The problem is that all of them are dying, and King Abdullah understood this. And in 2006, late 2006, early 2007, he created something called Majlis al-Baya, the Allegiance Council, which is composed of about 35 members, 16 sons and 19 grandsons of Abdulaziz. This is supposed to be the body. So there is a sort of moving away from, who do you want to be king? Who do you want to be king? To a more sort of a formal mechanism of choosing the king and the crown prince. And he instituted something called the succession law, which sort of guided this whole council. The problem is that system is still untested because they're still going by the next in line. And so there is a contradiction there. Thirdly, is now we have the grandsons coming. I think what they did is they just bought themselves about another 20 years of stability, roughly. Salman, let's assume he lives 7-8 years. He's 75-ish something. We would never have accurate dates. So if he lives as long as Abdullah is living, assuming he's in good health, so that gives you another 7-8 years, and then the crown prince. And who's becoming crown prince then? Mukran. Mukran just became second deputy prime minister. What does that mean? Crown prince in waiting. Mukran is young. He's the youngest surviving son of Abdulaziz, about 66, 67. Let's say he has another good 10, 12 years ahead of them. So you're looking at about a generation of respite. Then you're forced to nominate one of the grandsons. The problem with the grandson is not that they're bad, it's just that there are too many of them. So every one of them is going to say, well, I'm an aspirant. And this Majlis al-Baya assumes a democratic ethic on their part, that they will go by one man, one vote. It doesn't work that way. They're not used to that. They're used to the campfire thing. But the campfire cannot be applied anymore. And so you have a dilemma. And so there is going to be coming instability. That's why you see people like Al-Walid bin Talal pushing for this reform and saying, we need to move out. And already there's a lot of stress on the system. And so what do you have? You have the Arab, sort of a delayed Arab Spring, if you will. And then, water, there's water shortages, there is power shortages. How long will they be able to sell their oil? The United States went through a shale gas and oil revolution. So dependency on oil and gas from the Middle East is decreasing. So revenues will decrease. For a long time, India, China, Korea, Taiwan will buy oil from the Saudis. But ultimately, the West and Western investment is going to be decreasing. So you're looking at a situation where there's internal instability. And so there is the Arab Spring phenomenon coming in. So what do? Well, we'll worry about that later. Right now, the Muslim Brotherhood has to be contained. How do you contain them? Well, we'll bankroll all of the Salafi groups. Okay. The problem with that is you bankroll them. How do you tell people in your own country that that's only Salafis there, not here, not in this kingdom? You do not democratize in this kingdom. You democratize in Egypt, in Tunisia. Already Salman al-Awda, a very prominent Salafi Wahhabi scholar, who is saying, democracy may not be the ideal system, but it can be used. And this is a Salafi scholar sitting in Saudi Arabia saying this. So already you have those kind of problems coming up. So yes, the Muslim Brotherhood does, pose a problem. In terms of the Iran and Pakistan, I think that the Pakistanis are at a stage that where they are looking at the situation where they need to reduce dependency on the United States. They can't do it right now. So what they will do is they will use this as a bargaining chip to get something from the Americans, but they're not going to be just simply a bargaining chip. So at some point because everybody's waiting for what? From Total, the French oil corporation, to the Pakistanis, to anybody who is trying to do business with Iran, they're waiting for the sanctions to be lifted. So once the sanctions are lifted, the Pakistanis can come back and say, now we have a little bit more money now, the sanctions are gone, let's do this. So it's not just a bargaining chip. For now it is. They're going to the Americans and saying, well, you know what, I need natural gas, I'm going to go to the Iranians unless you do something. The Americans will say, oh, okay, don't go to the Iranians, we'll give you some money right now. But ultimately, Iran and the United States have to sort out their issues. And I don't believe, I actually wrote an article last night on Ayatollah Khamenei saying, we reject direct talks. I don't think he's rejecting direct talks. He's basically saying, the conditions are not right. He has a problem with Ahmadinejad. That has to be sorted out. There has to be a new president. I think come August, there will be some serious negotiations between the United States and Iran. And so the Pakistanis are doing that. The Turks, yes, they are also stuck in the sense that how can you have, a Kurdistan in Iraq and now a Kurdistan in Syria as well and not have a Kurdistan in Turkey? So that is their dilemma. So what they're trying to do is Barzani, they're trying to be friends with him because he's the main player, and they're trying to control that. You see, the thing is that Barzani and all these people ultimately want a country of their own. Are they going to get it? I don't think so. But they're going to have sufficient autonomy. And from the Iranian point of view, that's fine. As long as we have our sphere of influence, you can have your little autonomy. And you know what? As long as the Kurds oppose the Sunnis of Syria, that's good too, from the Iranian point of view. But for Turkey, this is a dilemma. And Turkey has to address the issue of Turkish nationalism. That, how far are you willing to accept Kurds as a minority? What kind of rights are you willing to give them? And that's at the heart of the equation. They're not as bad of a situation as the Saudis, but they have a problem. They have the Kurds issue, they have Al-Qaeda, and they just have a very long border with lots of refugees coming over. And if things work out the way I'm looking at, I'm forecasting, they're looking at really tough times. I hope that addresses your question. Sorry for the. The Alawites in Turkey are a bit different. The difference between the word matters. So the Alawiya in Syria and the Alavis in Turkey, they're different. The Alavis are more Kemalist. So that sort of alleviates some pressure off of the Turks, because you don't have Alawite sort of sectarian nationalism going on cross-border. But at the end of the day, it is something that they will have to address, because let's say, there is a reversal. And the Sunnis start butchering the Alawites in Syria. The Alawis will start screaming in Turkey, and then they will have to do something.
Number-wise, how many?
I don't have the number off the top of my head, but they are not a small number. They're a significant minority.
Any questions from the lady side? Ali, yeah.
Thank you very much. So you've sort of set out the sort of power plays in this sort of sectarian dimension, ideological dimension. What I'd like to know is there are some pressures, obviously socioeconomic pressures, there's the pressure of water, that actually in many ways I see is actually sort of ideally would encourage the countries like, Turkey, Iraq, Syria, Iran actually cooperate, because otherwise, they're all stuffed, they don't cooperate on issues like that. But I can see it going the other way and actually leading to violence. My question is, do you think these sort of sectarian geopolitics, they have their role, but what do you think about the other dimensions that probably have an equal or maybe even greater pressure in the future?
You're absolutely right. But at this point, because the situation is such in flux, politics takes over. And those economic shared interests, you sort of say, I'll get back to it later. I'll come back to that, but right now I have a bigger problem. I mean, if you are, Ahmed Davutoglu is a smart individual. He is the strategist for the Turkish government. When he looks at a map, he sees Iran on 3 borders: the Turkish-Iranian border, the Turkish-Iraqi border, and the Turkish-Syrian border. The AKP wants Turkey to be a great power. Iran wants to be a great power. Does that remind us of something? The Safavids and the Ottomans? And 1555, the war that basically gave Iraq to the Ottomans. So we're in many ways we're going back to that kind of a scenario. Can they work it out? I think I think if you look at the behavior of the Iranians and the behavior of the Turks, they're not really hostile to one another. They really try to sort of work around the problem. They have those deep-seated feelings against each other, because ultimately, from a Turkish geostrategic point of view, you were never going to get into the EU, and now the EU is not desirable. Turkey is much more wealthier than the EU. So they don't need to be a member of a club that's fading. It will be a long time before they can push into the Crimea, because the Russians are there. The only other place to go into in terms of expanding influence is the Middle East. But if you look at geography, like I just said, Iran is sitting in the path. So if you want to go this is why the Arab Spring is very good for Turkey, is that you could play in places, you could play in places like North Africa without having to worry about the Iranians. But ultimately, there was backlash from there. So last year in August, Prime Minister Erdogan went, and there was this huge debate going about secularism, and it's a really sensitive topic in Egypt. So he said, oh brothers, we should not look at secularism as ladin, as in kufr. We should look at it in terms of religious neutrality. The Brotherhood took offense to that. The Brotherhood said, well, we respect you and whatnot. Please don't give us a lecture on secularism. You have a different trajectory. You're from the Kemalist heritage. Ours is not that. And so there's a pushback from there. And right now, the Turks have to solve the problem of Iran. And to solve the problem of Iran, how do you solve the problem of Iran? And it's like this. Ultimately, how do you take out Bashar al-Assad? He's like that thread hanging from a sweater, that if you pull it, the whole sweater can unravel. And so how do you pull him and leave the sweater intact? This is the biggest dilemma for Turkey right now. And that's why they don't have a clear strategy. They say that, please resign, please step down, we'll support the refugees, they will act tough one day. But as soon as you see all these, suicide bombings taking place in Syria, they get really afraid and they say, what, we don't want, because ultimately, the Saudis have nothing to lose. They don't have a border with Syria. They can play this game and it could even benefit them, because think about it, if Syria falls, then the Iranian Shia position in Lebanon and in Iraq is at risk. And that is good from the Saudi point of view. Ultimately it will come to them, but then everybody has this sort of attitude of procrastination. I'll worry about it later.
Thank you very much. Anyone from the ladies? Yeah.
Assalamu alaikum. I have a couple questions.
Sure.
Thank you for your talk. First of all, with regards to the nuclear question, you haven't mentioned that today, and I'm curious to know what you think. Is how big is this question, and is it a big threat with regards to Syria and what's happening right now? And second of all, I'd like to hear what you think about the French intervention of Mali. And the threat of Al-Qaeda in the Maghreb. It seems to be this kind of the smaller group that's still aggressive, that's still dangerous, but is not very well understood.
Yes. Let's start with Mali and work our way to the harder question later. Mali, see, we have to understand Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda, since 2003, has devolved. So there is the organization that pulled off 9/11 and the United States went after in Afghanistan, it's gone. There's Zawahiri somewhere, but that's about it. He's issuing videotapes and that's it. He doesn't have any power. What happened is that the franchises of Al-Qaeda, the regional players, Yemen, Iraq, Maghreb, AQIM, Somalia, Pakistan, they started to develop themselves. So what you have is sort of a very regional Al-Qaeda. And what is Al-Qaeda's strategy? I mean, if you forget Al-Qaeda, just think about jihadis, because Al-Qaeda is a specific form of the jihad. The jihadi method to power is very simple. We cannot topple the state. The state is too powerful. We need to create chaos. So the purpose of 9/11 was to get the United States to lash back at the Muslim world, from their point of view, preferably Saudi Arabia, and that will create a crisis in which the more radical people will come up and they'll be able to benefit from that. They saw the same thing in the fall of Saddam, and that's why you had all those attacks against the Shia over there. Abu Musab al-Zarqawi clearly stated that we have a very short window of opportunity because our numbers are small here. If we achieve it, that's good. If not, then we have to either run away to somewhere else or we'll die here. We saw that in Afghanistan because all of these jihadis, they looked at the Taliban as their model. The Taliban, what did the Taliban emerge? They didn't emerge from some sort of a methodological, sort of very well-defined path that today I'll do this, tomorrow I'll do this, and this is how I'll get to power. No, it was anarchy. In anarchy, one group came out and one group was able to impose order, and it went from there. So they said, anarchy is what we need to create. In Pakistan, they're trying to create anarchy. Every time a bomb goes off, you have to think about it and say, well, how does this serve? What is the purpose behind it? Is the purpose just to attack this place, kill people? I mean, what is the method behind the madness? And so that's what they're trying to do. In Mali, you have in these circumstances, they were started from Algeria. Algeria, they got defeated, and so they moved into Mali. Mali became presented an opening, and therefore they're there. But Mali, Libya, Algeria, it's still sort of a contained thing. That's why the United States is not interested. But the French are. This is the French sphere of influence. And the French need to make sure that, the other side of the Mediterranean, there's some order there. It doesn't completely go into chaos mode. The other thing is that, much of the smaller power, there's still one of the things is that so for example, long after communism was gone, the U.S. intelligence was still chasing the Russians because it was something they had learned to do. It was institutionalized. It takes time to shift gears. Now, Al-Qaeda is very sort of last decade thing. Now it's the Arab Spring. Now it's, sectarianism. But governments around the world are not so easy to sort of shift gears. think of bureaucracies. It's also very job security. Well, I know how to chase Al Qaeda, and I need to have the government will close the budget. I'll have to close this department. Livelihoods will go away, and therefore we need to continue fighting. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is that it may be important for France, but it's not important for the United States anymore. They've dealt with it. From the U.S. point of view, it was very clear. In the U.S. Bush administration policymakers used to frame it as such, saying, well, as long as they're blowing stuff up in Baghdad and Afghanistan, that's fine. They shouldn't do it in Manhattan. Okay, we can live with that. This is the French. This is just too close for the French. This is and it's sort of a perspective. And ultimately, the United States can just walk away from all of this one day and say, I'm done. I can't afford this anymore. I'll go. And geography matters. For France right there. So France has to intervene from their point of view. Will they be successful? We'll see. I mean, so far, they're repeating what happened in Afghanistan. The United States came in, toppled the government, but the Taliban are still there. They're still fighting the Taliban 10 years later. Now they're negotiating with them. The French have come in. The Mujao, the AQIM, the Ansar ad-Din, and all these groups have been chased out of those towns. Every day you hear the report that they're being chased out. But where are they being chased out to? The mountains. They will come back. There will be an insurgency. 5, 7 years, 8 years down the line, there will be a negotiated settlement of some sort, or at least the process will happen. I hope that answers your question about Mali. Nuclear issue. This is probably the least understood around the world. Let me ask everybody a question. What country has ever created a nuclear weapon by parading it publicly? Pick up any country that has nuclear weapons, none of them did it publicly. Everything was covert. The Soviets got it covertly, the United States, the Chinese, the Brits, the French, South Africa, Israel, Pakistan, India. No country has ever said, by the way, I'm making nuclear weapons. They never say that. Why is Iran doing that? Why Iran is doing that is because Iran is using it as a bargaining chip. There are things that Iran wants. Number one is end of sanctions. Number two is recognition of their regime. Number three is recognition that they are a player and they have a sphere of influence. How can you force a negotiation? Well, you have to you have to have some leverage. So you say, okay, we have enriched uranium to 5%. 2 years later, we're doing 10%. Now they're talking 20%. So you create this psychology and you shape perceptions on the other side. Then, oh my God, we have to control this somehow. So, and they unfortunately are, from the point of view of the West, have a good geography. There used to be a lot of discussion after Iraq, it's going to be Iran. Iran is next. Iran was never next. There was a reason for that. You're not going to use an A1M1 Abram tank and send it up to Zagros. It's just not doable. You cannot invade Iran from Iraq. You cannot invade it from Afghanistan. You cannot invade it from Azerbaijan. Azerbaijan doesn't want this, as much as they hate the Iranians. The Turkmens will not want it. And that, by the way, that is a Russian sphere of influence. Even if these countries would help covertly the United States, the Russians would come in. That leaves the Persian Gulf. If you fire a Tomahawk cruise missile from the Persian Gulf into Iran, oil will go to $250 a barrel, like that. The Iranians understand this. They're manipulating this whole situation because they feel that, the chances, can they be perfectly sure that they will not get bombed? No. They go by probabilities. Everybody goes by probabilities. And so they say, look, we're not going to get bombed. We can keep doing this. And what is going to happen? We're going to get these guys to negotiate. And therefore you see the negotiations. The back channels, the P5+1 group, and now Biden saying, we're ready for direct negotiations, which isn't a new thing. The Bush administration, George W. Bush, came up with this first. He offered, after the bomb earthquake in 2003, he offered to send his father and with a big delegation from the government to help the Iranians to recover from the earthquake and open negotiations. The Iranians at that point in time were not ready because Ayatollah Khamenei wanted Khatami to leave power because they were not on the same page. and he was waiting for the conservatives to take over. But then once the conservatives took over, Ahmadinejad created a bigger problem for Khamenei because he was much more ambitious. He's the most ambitious president in the history of Iran, the Islamic Republic of Iran. And therefore, the nuclear issue is a bargaining chip for the most part. What does that mean? Does that mean that Iran will behave like Libya did in 2003 and said, well, here's all our WMD stock. Here's everything we got from the Pakistanis and anybody else. And so can you rehabilitate us now? Can you start doing business with us now? Iran is not going to do that. There's a lot of pride. Iran wants to be a big player. There's, the culture is very different. What they want is ultimately they do want a nuclear program. They say that there's a fatwa that it's haram to make nuclear weapons. Okay, lots of things are haram. People still do them. So we don't know. But ultimately, they are going about getting a nuclear weapon in a very, very unorthodox way. Very different from any other country. I mean, you look at the history of any country's nuclear program, you will never see any public mention of it, even after they got it. But they're doing it very publicly. They will have these television cameras from Press TV, going about showing everything and whatnot. That's very strange. You don't develop nuclear weapons like that. But ultimately, they want to be able to have this technology. And they know that the odds are stacked up against them. Will Israel bomb them? Israel cannot bomb them because Israel doesn't have the physical air force to do it. So one of the things we do in my line of work is we sort of quantify everything. That in order to bomb a certain facility, you need X number of aircraft, you need X number of sorties, that means X number of fuel, what kind of ammunition can they dump. One of the things that the Iranians have done is they have dispersed their program across a wide geography, and it's buried deep under mountains and concrete. So there's a debate whether the MOP, the massive ordnance penetrator missile, that sort of goes in and it first destroys the facility and then it explodes inside the facility. Will that be able to penetrate, Natanz? And as far as I understand, they're not sure. They're not sure that can be done. And so ultimately, it comes back to the negotiations. And I think Iran has bigger problems. It has an economy that it has to deal with before it can deal with the nuclear weapon. So for now, it's, okay, we will suspend enrichment. You take off the sanctions. That's the game right now. Make sense? Okay.
Let's have Manzurka.
You mentioned briefly the situation of Turkey and compared it to take lessons from Pakistan. Say if the situation in Syria continues for 1 or 2 more years, how far, I want 2 questions. Firstly, that how much of the initiative Turkey took of its own to get into this situation, and whether it has been forced into this situation. That is the first one thing. The second situation is, say if this situation continues for another 1 or 2 years, like Pakistan, say the situation started to deteriorate from Peshawar, and now it has gone down to Karachi.
Mm-hmm.
So how far backwards it can go to westwards in Turkey, similar to what happened in Pakistan. So if you can throw some light on those 2.
Of course. First of all, no political actor. I mean, one of the things that you miss in academia, in scholarly works, in newspaper articles, is sort of this appreciation for constraints. One of the least appreciated thing is how constrained people are. We have sort of, and not just us, Muslims are sort of a bit carried away with conspiracy theories, unfortunately, but even amongst everybody else in the world, there is this sort of Hollywoodization of everything, is that, America can do everything. No, it can't. There are certain things. I just explained it cannot bomb Iran and then not have $300, $250 barrel of oil. There are consequences. So ultimately, nobody wants to do something. Most regimes are of a conservative nature. They like things the way they are. They don't want to tamper with them. In fact, they're hoping that nothing goes wrong. So to answer your question, Turkey didn't want this to happen. Notice Turkey was a very good ally of Bashar al-Assad. They were very close to him. But the problem for Turkey is that he can't manage his internal situation. And if he can't manage his internal situation, then that threatens them as well. Because if he can't control his country, he falls, then what? So it's not that we want him to fall, it's that he will fall by himself. And then we need to be doing something. And we cannot wait for him to fall. We have to do something now so we are prepared to deal with the consequences at the time. Now you start from that position, then come the Saudis and say, you know what, you don't like Iran, we don't like Iran. We need to make sure this guy goes because that will weaken Iran. And then you get carried away, you get steered into things that you did not originally want to do. The United States tells you tell the United States, this is a problem, you need to solve it, you are the superpower. They says, we're done. 10 years, too much. We have enough problems. This is your problem, you deal with it. Okay, ball is back in my court. I'm Turkey. So now I'm forced to do things that I would not have otherwise wanted to. Why would I not want to? Is because we talked about the Kurdish issue. There's the Kurdish issue, there is Al-Qaeda, and then there's just sheer anarchy. Do you want, what is the worst case scenario that can happen? You can have Al-Qaeda fighting Hezbollah in Syria. Do the Turks want that on their border? No, they don't want that on their border. Nobody would want that on their border, and therefore they are forced to make difficult choices. And one of the things we need to understand is that when people are not in office, especially if they're running elections, they will promise everything under the sun. Everything. Look at Obama. He said, Iraq, bad war. Afghanistan, good war. Is he waging war in Afghanistan? No. The first thing after he came into office was downgrade public expectations. Oh, we will talk to the Taliban if they leave Al-Qaeda. We will shake the hand of Iran. We will do this, we will do that. So ultimately, people don't want that kind of a problem. To answer your question about the analogy between Peshawar and Karachi and how it goes into the West, I don't think Turkey will face a jihadi problem. It's because Pakistan faced a jihadi problem because Pakistan was very jihadized internally. I mean, these people didn't just come from Afghanistan. Lal Masjid didn't happen Lal Masjid happened because of Ziaul Haq. Actually, you can go back all the way to Ayub Khan. Ayub Khan gave, what's his name? The Maulana Abdul Aziz's father, the mosque. He made him the imam, and then Ziaul Haq, gave them a lot of privileges and a lot of preferential treatment. Turkey doesn't have that problem. But what Turkey has is a Kurdish problem. So I think the Kurds will become a nightmare. They will see attacks in the West. They will see that sort of fire spreading through Turkey in the southeast and sort of those kind of areas. There'll be a little bit of Al-Qaeda. One of the things when the U.S. consulate in Istanbul was just bombed recently was the big question, is this Al-Qaeda? Is this Syria, Al-Qaeda spilling over from Syria now into Turkey? Turns out it was a left-wing group. And that left-wing group is being used by the Assad regime to send a message to Turkey that, this is just a sample of what could happen. So could you back off? Could you not push against us too hard? So these are subtle messages. So if there is a bomb going off somewhere, we have to ask our question, yes, people die, and that is sad and unfortunate, but what is the political motive behind doing that? There's always a political motive. So why do Taliban attack Data Darbar in Pakistan, or Barelvis, or Shia or Qadianis, or even kill Christians, or they go after sort of the other sect? Is because they want to create chaos. So the Pakistani government now has a problem with the Taliban. Now the Shia are already screaming that you don't protect us. Then you have the majority Barelvi community saying, well, our biggest shrine just got bombed, what are you doing? And you have the Christians also putting pressure, and that creates anarchy. So there is a method to this madness of suicide bombing here and there. The guy who's doing the suicide bombing, well, he's not told about this. He's told you're going to heaven. So you do this. But the strategists, they're looking at a chessboard, and they're very Machiavellian. And they're saying, okay, this is and they believe in that. They believe that this is really convoluted if you think about it. They believe that this is somehow a divine thing that they're doing. They're following the divine plan of Allah. somehow. It's strange, but that's what I hope that answers your question.
Thank you very much. I think we'll end the... Oh, yeah, okay, fine. One more question.
Kamran, this is not within your scope of your talk tonight, but could you say something about Israel and some of the dynamics going on there? And given Obama's new term, whether we can expect any shift or any of your assessment of what's happening in that area?
I think that Israel, for Israel, this is the worst situation. Israel has been able to, sustain its borders, and become this kind of power that it is, a major power in the Middle East, because it divided its neighbors. The Arabs were divided, and they were weak and divided. Now the fear right now is that, are we moving away from that situation where the Arabs are divided and weak? Are they becoming empowered? Well, not really, not just yet. But policymakers cannot wait for it to happen. Policymakers have to think of ahead. So and when you lose leverage, one of the biggest benefits to Israel was the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty, 1978. What did that do? Why was that important? Because the biggest Arab state just said, no more war with you. Finished. We're at peace with you. That means that, Lebanon can do whatever it wants, Syria can do whatever it wants, the Jordanians are not doing anything anyway, therefore all we have to worry about is the Palestinians. And they're a domestic issue anyway. If Egypt, and I'm not convinced that the Brotherhood is going to do that, even if they achieved complete power, they wouldn't do that, because at the end of the day, they have 80 million people to feed. 80 million people will not be fed if they make war with Israel. They will lose, investment and whatnot. They're a poor country. So I think that pragmatism will prevail. But Israeli policymakers cannot bet on that. They have to assume worst case scenario just because Israel is very small. And one of the reasons why was it very important to have this latest war in Gaza? Israel cannot tolerate long-range weapons because it's just so small geographically. And that's it. It's over. If the other side has long-range weapons, your heartland, the Haifa, Jerusalem, Tel Aviv corridor is threatened. That's where the bulk of the Israeli population lives. It's an intolerable national security threat. So that's why they had to go to war. They didn't know how many missiles were there. And the goal was not to topple Hamas. Hamas can't be toppled. That requires an amount of force that the Israelis don't have, and they're not interested in doing that. But they wanted to neutralize all those long-range weapons. Why do they bomb convoys coming through Sudan? Because the Iranians are supplying those missiles, and those missiles come through Sudan, up Egypt, into the Gaza Strip. And so I think that what Israel is doing right now is trying to make the most of a very difficult situation because they're losing leverage. What they have hope, for the time being, from their point of view, is that these governments will not stabilize. This Arab Spring is just going to be chaotic. They have to worry about the chaos. That's a security threat too. But it's not like these countries are going to become powerful and they're going to have an existential threat. And the other thing is, what we started this discussion with, is the geosectarianism, is that ultimately all my neighbors will fight, and what we have, and the Turks will be looking at this, and we will be looking at it. Iran will be playing with it. But as long as the immediate neighbors are, in chaos, in commotion, we're okay. But again, how sustainable is that? Can they assume that will be the case forever? No. So for them, this is a really difficult geostrategic environment, which is getting more and more difficult as time goes by. So that's where they are right now.
Thank you very much. We'll end there.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.